Greetings everyone. In this episode I'll cover finishing up the new Cockpit Soul, tell you about the bilge pump I researched and am installing, talk about closed cell foam flotation, and finally start painting the spars. In the last episode I showed you tearing out the old rotten Cockpit Soul and preparing the new structure for the new Soul. The old Cockpit Soul only had two small supports underneath the decking, and I wanted to add more that also tied into the hull for better structural support. I also covered in the last episode how I installed these new supports with thickened epoxy and fiberglass. Once all four supports were laid in and the epoxy cured, it was time to cover the hull and new structure supports with a couple of coats of epoxy-based bilge paint. The wood was already covered in epoxy and another layer of fiberglass, but adding this paint will help keep the area clean and protected from water. The next step was to start building the new decking on the Cockpit Soul. The first part of this was to build some deck panels that go underneath the seats. It was not a load-bearing deck plate, so I could make it out of 2 layers of 1/4-inch thick marine plywood. Each edge of the old deck flange and the new plywood would be sealed with epoxy and painted with epoxy-based bilge paint. I made a template pattern out of some paper that would cover the area I needed the deck plate. It didn't have to be perfect, as I wanted a gap between the old flange and the new plywood. It's not good to place plywood seams directly up against each other in a joint like that. This would allow them to have a gap between them for the thickened epoxy and fairing compound. Then the entire thing, including the new seam, would be covered in another layer of plywood and fiberglassed over to seal it all in. After cutting out the new plywood deck plates on the port and starboard side, it was time to start working on the new center section of the Cockpit Soul that would support most of the weight. An idea came to me as I was working out just how I was going to put this down. I have tons of salvaged wood I have taken from old houses over the years and have been looking for a good use for them. There's nothing more noble than using it for a sailboat. I have always loved the look of wood on a boat and decided instead of laying down another fiberglass Cockpit Soul, I would instead use wood planks. So I set to work cleaning up, cutting, and assembling several old pine boards using a simple but strong rabbet joint into a new Cockpit Soul. Next, I used some Total Boat 5:1 epoxy to glue it all together. I really have been impressed with this epoxy for its use with fiberglass and as a glue. It created a very strong, solid, and waterproof bond between the plank edges for the structure that was going to take a lot of use. Once it cured, it was time to sand it down to smooth it out, remove the excess epoxy from the joints, and make the new decking as even and flat as I could. A little fine sanding with the random orbital sander, and I'm pretty happy with the results. Now it's time for a finish. But before I put the new Cockpit Soul down, I need to address a positive flotation issue. With lead ballast, this boat will sink if it takes on too much water. The area under the Cockpit Soul is largely a void with no flotation, so I think I needed to address that. After a lot of research, I decided to use polyurethane expanding foam, as it has a largely closed cell structure and provides good bonding with the hull. Even as a closed cell material, it can still have problems if it is exposed to water too often and for too long. So I needed to keep a center channel where the water could flow down into the bilge and keep the foam off to the sides. While this won't keep the entire boat afloat, it should be enough to keep at least the stern from going under for some level of recovery. As I continue to have good luck with Total Boat products, I went with Jamestown Distributors Total Boat 2-part polyurethane expanding foam. It's simple to use and has a good flotation rating. I built some cardboard baffles to contain the foam to the sides of the hull and mixed up some small batches of the 1:1 product resin and activator. There are a lot of demonstrations with this process on YouTube, and having a chemistry background, I know how fast and prolific this reaction is. I poured the 2 parts and started to feel the exothermic reaction coming through the mixing cup and poured the mixture into one side of the mold. The expansion reaction should have started soon after, but it never really did. The expansion should have been pretty prolific and quick, easily visible. Although it did eventually expand, it did so very slowly and over a long period of time and did not seem to expand as much as it should. I mixed up several other batches and had the same result, so I called Total Boat and talked to a couple of their experts. I had the proper mixture ratio, and the temperature and humidity were all well within limits of application. But something just seemed to have been wrong. This is where the product's worth includes good customer service. Total Boat's consultants worked with me not only to find the problem, but immediately set out to fix the problem. They spent far more time with me than they made profit on the sale of that product. They really want good results for their customers and long-term relationships. One of the first things they did in my case was to send me out a new kit, which they personally checked to make sure was a fresh batch of reagents, and they made sure it personally was loaded onto the outgoing shipment pallet to get to me as soon as possible. That's something I really appreciated. Anyone who goes out of their way to make sure people get what they need and see to it personally is the mark of top quality service. Waiting for the new foam kit to come in, I needed to move on to some other checklist items. I wanted to replace the bilge pump, and the research I did for this new one took a while. So many of these pumps have dodgy ratings on Amazon, with some people swearing by them and some people swearing at them. Many seem to break within weeks of installation. I ultimately chose the SPX Flow 650 Auto Bilge Pump from Johnson Pumps. Go! It was very highly rated and had a lot of features I liked. Rather than a purely mechanical float switch, this pump uses an electronic switch to detect rising water levels. It is essentially an all-in-one but modular unit, so parts can be replaced if needed. The entire pump motor can be replaced from the top, and replacing it without having to unscrew the impeller or any other components. The pump comes with a check valve, which will come in handy. This prevents water that hasn't made it out of the discharge hose not to flow back into the bilge, then triggering the pump to kick back on endlessly on and off until it burns out the pump or drains the battery. I did change around the wiring so that I could place a switch in the line so that normally the pump is on automatic, but I can throw the switch to manually engage the pump if needed. Mounting it to a small piece of scrap fiberglass and using some epoxy to secure it to the bottom, it should be ready for use once I install it into the electrical system. A couple of days later, my new Total Boat expanding foam kit came in, and it was time to button up the cockpit project. This new expanding foam kit did the trick. I could feel the heat of the exothermic reaction being given off in the mixture of the two-part components much faster. Once it started, it was time to pour it into the cavities of the hull and watch it expand. This is sped up a little bit for time, but the expansion was a lot better than previous attempts. Again, having a company that backs up its products and works hard for its customers when something goes wrong is exactly what I wanted to use for all the hard work I put into this project. So thanks to Total Boat for being proactive about solving this problem. Once the foam was all in and done expanding, it was time to lay down the Cockpit Soul Components. First the center section where our feet will go, then the side deck plates under where the seats are. I think it looks great. Just about ready for some trim now. Now it was time to add some supports to the seats. There were some with the original design, but not enough. I wanted the new seats to be strong and transfer any loads into the new hull structure under the cockpit sole rather than just into the cockpit decking. Each one had to be fitted with an angle to the cockpit sole, as well as placement for the underlying support of the new structures I installed. With the new supports in place, the new seats along with the new cockpit sole were solid and had no flex or deflection whatsoever. Ready now to move on to trimming the new seat on the port side. Again, I used my router with a roller bearing guide and used the old seat as a template to get an exact curve and trim of the new marine plywood to allow the teak seats on top to fit exactly as they had before. Looks pretty good. There'll be some finish trim that goes on this to cover up the plywood edge. Next, it was time to finally start on the spars. They had a pretty beaten up paint job on them, and they were painted with a color that was a little too dark. I didn't want to remove all the paint, but for the gaff boom and main boom, I really had no choice. Paint was in such bad shape, simply priming and painting over it would not have looked good. So I took about a day and a half to sand off all of the paint on the gaff and the boom. Thoroughly cleaned it with some acetone and got ready for primer. I chose to use Kill's Complete Primer that I was told worked well on metal, especially aluminum, which can be tricky to paint or even prime. I applied 2 or 3 coats by brush and frankly, really was not pleased with the results. The primer did not smooth out at all, was really thick and seemed to gum up easily, leaving brush marks and unsightly patches along the spars. If I was going to use this on the mast, I needed to find a better way of applying it. I don't recommend brushing it on spars. Once I had 2 coats of primer, I used Total Boat's Wet Edge Topside paint in Bristol Beige, which is the traditional color of the spars. Marshall Marine still uses this color to paint their spars on their Sanderling and Marshall 22 catboats. The paint went on very well, had a great look to it, as well as being the exact color I wanted. Primer issues aside, Total Boat's Wet Edge paint made them look like new again. Next, it was time to paint the mast. Not wanting the same texture problems I had before with the booms, I tried applying the primer using a roller, and that did the trick. The primer went on smoothly, evenly, and did not have any of the brushstroke problems of gumming up blotching I had using a brush. So if you want to use Kills primer, or perhaps any other, I highly recommend you use a roller and not use a brush for better results. Next, 2 coats of Total Boat Wet Edge paint in Bristol Beige again. Traditionally, catboats and gaff rig boats have the tips of their mast as white, so I taped off the top and got ready to apply some other paint on the top when I got around to that. After so many weeks and months of a boat that looked worse than when I got it, there's nothing like a good paint job on something you have been working on to start to bring the life back to it again. Now it was time to start looking into putting primer down on the deck. But before I do that, I need to waterproof the core around the existing holes for deck fittings in preparation for the new ones. I covered this in a previous episode, but it bears repeating on why to do this and how to do it. It's not really a question of if, it's a question of when water is finally going to get through the opening for a fitting and get somewhere where you don't want it. As such, any little bit of water that gets trapped in the core will start to lead to rot. So here's how to protect yourself against that. First off, I open the hole up just a little bit bigger than it takes for the fitting. I seal the bottom to keep the epoxy from running out, and then pour in some slightly thickened epoxy into the hole and let it cure. After that, I re-drill the hole for the fitting and run it through. This way, the wood core has epoxy insulating it from any water that might make it through the hole for the fitting, and keep it from getting wet and rotting. So each hole for every cleat, winch base, or anything else for that matter, was drilled out larger than the bolt would need to be to hold the fitting in place. Once all the holes were opened up, it was time to temporarily cover the underside so that the epoxy would not run through and stay in the newly drilled holes until it cured. Painter's tape works fine for me. Getting into some hard places is always fun, so I didn't film those. Next, time to mix some epoxy. Total Boat products usually come with some graduated measuring cups for this sort of thing, and they do a great job, and they are reusable. But if you ever run out of them or don't have a clean one handy, there's an alternative. I often use plastic containers to mix up small batches. Cured epoxy won't stick to it. Once the leftover epoxy is cured, then you can simply crack out the leftover hardened epoxy and use the container again. You'll know you're using the right kind of plastic container when you see a number 5 on the bottom in the recycle symbol. Once I got the epoxy pumped in, I mixed some silica thickener. It doesn't have to be an exact ratio of thickness to epoxy. Frankly, straight epoxy would work well, as would something a little thicker than this, but I think a little viscosity in it does help to make a stronger plug. I pour the mixture into a plastic bag and cut a small corner out of the bag, using it like a pastry piping bag. Just fill up each of the holes until full, then give each hole a couple of minutes to settle. You will likely see a few bubbles work themselves to the top, and a light tapping on the deck near the holes with a screwdriver handle will help burp those holes. Then you can add a little bit more thickened epoxy. Avoiding these air pockets is easier when the epoxy is not too thick. While all that epoxy is curing, I decided to start stripping and sanding the teak wood on the boat, especially around the combing and the rub rails. I ordinarily don't like to use anything heavy to do this, but with the grain raised so high on the combing, a belt sander was the only way to start this off. Even unfinished, after a day of sanding, I can't believe how much better the wood looked. But some tight spots still needed some detail sanding. I've used some detail sanders in the past that really don't work very well, but I found this Ryobi detail sander worked extremely well and I highly recommend it. Now for some finish. Remember, don't use Cetal Marine, use Cetal Natural Teak. After one last fine sanding, I applied the Cetal Natural Teak and it came out looking fantastic. No need to sand between coats, and they recommend that you not sand for the best results. I applied it around the cockpit combing, trim around the cabin house, and the teak rub rail. Wow, another huge improvement. In the next episode, I'll remount the deck hardware and show you some tools to make that a little simpler. Start applying the primer on the deck. And rebuild the outboard motor. I'll have another episode out as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.